It's your time. So I'll pick questions as I see them, and I'll try and go around the room.
From China Daily. I mean, even Ambassador Roy said, I mean, still too early to say there is a China policy. It means, you know, people have not been appointed. But isn't it a sort of a pleasant surprise to you guys, I mean, experts, I mean, that, you know, almost a year ago, when Trump was elected, people worried about the incoming trade war. Now, I don't think many people worry about this anymore. So, and the relationship since Mar-a-Lago, I mean, it seems to be pretty good. Even his tweets yesterday sounds very good. So, is that a surprise to you? I mean, Trump actually, despite his criticism at home for being irrational, but he actually looks rational in U.S.-China relationship. And also, you know, if you could, I mean, how during Trump's visit to China, how the two sides should approach each other on, you know, those economic trade issues. Obviously, you mentioned the trading balance, but all economists believe this is not an issue. But why Trump people insist on that? So how they should insist, you know, deal with each other? I mean, BIT, trading balance, you know, IPR. You said, you know, it won't be solved until China reaches a certain income level or whatever. I mean, so Wilbur Ross said there was no breakthrough on the trip. Thank you.
Countries can survive in the world without any policies. You don't need a policy to go out of your front door and go to work and to engage in everyday activities. But the absence of a policy prevents you from dealing with issues that develop over time and where you can see what's coming, and there are ways to mitigate bad outcomes and to produce good outcomes. So I agree with you that President Trump's handling of the China relationship has been more stable than most people were worried about when he was elected as president, and continued to talk during the transition to becoming president. This alone was a very big departure from American tradition. Normally, a president-elect never comments on current policy issues during the transition because you have an existing president. But here's what I would say as a practicer of diplomacy. In dealing with enemies or hostile forces, there are some advantages to creating uncertainty. But in dealing with friends and allies, there are enormous disadvantages in having them uncertain as to how you will behave. And that's for the reason that Dr. Lampton mentioned. They want certainty that you will live up to your treaty obligations. They don't want uncertainty. And when you threaten to annihilate a third of the Korean people, when you have an alliance with 2/3 of the Korean people, you don't get the outcome that Bob is talking about, which is South Korea didn't breathe a sigh of relief that he was taking a hard line with North Korea. This fed the concept that the Americans are prepared to use atomic weapons against Asians, but won't use them against non-Asians. And believe it or not, there are people in Asia who believe that, including the Japanese. So you end up with creating impressions that are not the ones you want. Now, I agree that Prime Minister Abe and President Xi Jinping and President Moon in South Korea and the other Southeast Asian leaders who have met with President Trump have generally used those relationships effectively to try to stabilize their relationships. But we don't know what they really think about the president. What do they think when he doesn't show up at an East Asia summit? What do they think about trying to balance their long-term interests in dealing with the United States, which, if we play a responsible role in East Asia, can contribute to China rising peacefully without becoming domineering in dealing with its neighbors, as opposed to dealing with a China whose economy is of vital importance to their own economic prosperity, but which has the potential to become domineering. And so the United States, from their standpoint now, is a factor of uncertainty. And that does not enhance our foreign policy. But another way of looking at it, which actually you hear from them, is that the Asians look on our president as a wheeler dealer, a deal maker, without any principles behind it. You just cut the best deal you can. And Asians love that because they're the best wheeler dealers in the world. And you contrast that in Asia with Europe, where people like to behave in terms of principle and standards and things like this, and they're judgmental of our president. And as a result, the European leaders don't have those close relations with President Trump. So the factors that, that Bob cited are examples of the Asians actually manipulating our president effectively to advance their interests. And so far, it's hard to see that anything that we have gotten out of it other than an avoidance of totally unnecessary crises, which I think is a good thing, and I give him credit for having been steered away from unnecessary crises. But I haven't yet seen the benefits that would and should flow from an actively engaged United States in one of the fastest growing regions of the world, which has some very, very dangerous foreign policy problems, including the North Korean problem, which requires cooperation between China and the United States to manage effectively.
Yukon, there was economic part. Do you see any opportunities for economic progress in this trip or in the near future?
If, on the Chinese side, I would basically say the following: what is President Trump really interested in? He wants to basically say, "I've managed to get a deal which generates jobs in the U.S." Okay. If I were on the Chinese side, I would say your focus, therefore, shouldn't really be upon trade issues. Your focus should be on investment flows which could lead to greater growth in jobs in America. And the answer to that question, substantively, actually, is it's possible because America's great strength is services. So if I free up foreign investment flows between China and the United States, what's likely to come out of the U.S. is basically more investment in services. Because this is not a manufacturing country. They're not going to be moving their plants. The Europeans are doing that. The European Airbus, everybody, they're all produced in China. For the U.S., it's services. And this is where China can do a lot. It could basically say, I'm liberalizing, and they've said that in their party Congress statements. So here's the hang-up. The hang-up means that the White House has to think about liberalizing investment flows, but all along they've been saying, I'm investing too much overseas. I'm losing jobs. They haven't realized, in fact, the structure of America's economy is such that if I liberalize investment flows with China, I actually generate more jobs at home. I don't lose jobs at home. So this is, to me, a relatively simple, but also a bit complicated nuance that the Chinese negotiators and American negotiators need to focus on.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, and then we'll go to the lady in the front here, and then we'll go back there.
Thank you very much. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. My question is for Ambassador Roy. You mentioned the linkage between the full unification and the rejuvenation of the Chinese nations.
Oh, she mentioned that.
She mentioned that, yeah. She mentioned that in his speech. Do you see any sense of urgency in Beijing or in Taipei, even though these kinds of sense would be opposite? One side would be afraid of reunification, and the other side would push for the reunification. Did you see any sense of urgency? And yesterday, the Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Hsien Loong, said here that right now the best thing for us could hope is that a standoff will be kept in the Taiwan Strait and things don't go worse. So do you see any possibility that the standoff will be broken, will be overcome after the 19th Party Congress? Do you see a bigger
possibility or smaller possibility?
No.
Thank you.
I don't see any sense of urgency. The public opinion in Taiwan is overwhelmingly in favor of maintaining the status quo, and mainland China's policy is to maintain the status quo. They're opposed to unilateral actions to try to break away from the status quo. No, there is not a sense of urgency. But President Xi has done two things now that raise a question mark as to whether or not a sense of urgency may emerge that is not related to possibilities, but is related to a potential policy change. The first thing was, using Deng's phrase and paraphrasing it, he said, this issue cannot be left to future generations. They never expanded on that question, but that implied that there was some sort of time limit that might emerge. And now that time limit has been made explicit in his speech, except that the time limit is far enough down the road. Now, here there's a difference, you see. For Americans, something 35 down the years of the road, we don't even have to start thinking about that for 20 or 30 years.
Till 30 years now.
But in China, time has collapsed. And 35 years is a mere drop, you know, in Chinese history. And as a result, when he talks about something by mid-century, it seems to be getting closer all the time. But he has not put a sense of urgency on it, and that's quite clear.
Yes, you were.
Thank you. Nadia Chow with the Liberty Times. I have a question for Professor Huang. You mentioned corruption seems to be a very effective way to release the resources from those who own to those who can make a profit. So what does Xi Jinping's anti-corruption do in China? I mean, will he continue to do that, or actually it harmed the Chinese economic growth? And the second question to Professor Sutter, President Tsai in Taiwan has been calling for a new model of a cross-strait relationship. After Xi Jinping's remark in 19 Party Congress, she made some remark this morning again. I just wondered, do you see any potential for the two sides to interact, I mean, officially? Thank you.
Let me just pose the issue here. 30 years ago, when China opened up, it basically had the question of all the resources are owned by the state: land, finance, the right to operate, even where workers could reside. That particular system, of course, didn't lead to much growth. So Deng Xiaoping basically had to introduce incentives in the system. So he let the private sector start to come in. But they don't own the resources. So how do you get the resources over to the private sector fast? Corruption played this role. But if you go back in economic history, it's not called corruption. It's called township village enterprises. All right? I'm the local authorities. I own all the resources. You're a private person. You come to me. We strike a deal. What makes China different is that the system encourages both parties to invest and grow. Because if you think about India, private entrepreneurs own the land and resources. They go to a local Indian official. They want to do something. That Indian official only makes money if he holds it up. He gets a bribe. Corruption does not lead to growth. In China, the local official's incentive is, in fact, the more you grow, the more my share is. That's been very effective. It's, to me, actually, as an economist, a very practical solution to a problem. Because suppose you said the opposite. What would our textbooks recommend? Our textbook would recommend either privatization, which is politically not possible, or it would recommend have very strong rules of law that govern behavior, have strong institutions that know how to use these resources properly. It would have taken a couple generations. Now, here's the issue today. How come this can't continue? Because socially or equity or morally, society is now getting bothered by this. So it's not just an economic issue, it's broadly a social issue. how does she address this? She's basically trying to make sure that people start to behave. So there is now, of course, an emphasis of the rule of law in the new system. It's to govern the role of the party, to try to get the people to behave and handle things properly. But for this to work, you also need a clear definition of what the state should be, the role of the state, the role of the market, and as we indicated, this has not been addressed. So I personally think that inevitably these issues do need to be addressed, but they're not going to be quick. And in the interim, you can also have a lot of uncertainty and growth can actually come down. So there's a lot of people in China which say people aren't making decisions, if you don't know what you can do, the economy is going to suffer a little bit. And I just pose basically that this is a problem. I don't necessarily have the solution to it, but I think people need to recognize what I call the economic incentive issues that are unique in China. It's not just a moral issue. It's a systemic issue to the system, actually.
Yes, ma'am. Right in the middle.
She wants me to answer the
I'm
question
sorry,
on
Bob.
Taiwan.
Yes.
No problem.
Yeah.
It's a short answer. Given the situation, I think the quote of what the Prime Minister of Singapore said is where we are. The best we can hope for is a standoff. And I think that's a big change in cross-strait. I just don't see it at this point.
Would you, the other part of the question being the 92 consensus, China's not going to move on that one?
No, I think it's, I think the standoff is where we are.
Thank you, Jeanette Jiang, China Times, Taiwan. This is a question for all the panelists. Maybe a bit cynical, but I can't resist to ask. Do you think this so-called China dream or Chinese dream in the 21st century might end up to become a nightmare? Thank you.
A what?
A nightmare.
Nightmare.
No, I don't think so. China will grow. It'll be more influential. They'll have a lot of things they can point to that'll be advances. My point is they'll be constrained. That's all. They'll run across obstacles and they'll be frustrated in various times. And so I think it's just not going to be smooth sailing at all. And so I don't think it'll be a nightmare. I think it's a natural ambition for a country like China with its background, and as its capabilities grow, it's going to want to grow its influence, and so that'll continue.
Yes, in the back.
Thank you. Reporter from Voice America. I have two questions. I'd like the panelists to go back to comment on Chinese.
Let's just try one, and we go on for about 7 more minutes.
Okay. One is about President Xi Jinping said China is going to build a world-class military, and he also mentioned that military force is built for to fight a war. So my question is,
Fight and win.
Final win. So what kind of war he is thinking in his mind, and also with whom? Thank you.
Well,
anyone who knows, excuse me, go ahead.
No, I just had a small, when they practice against the United States.
Yeah. The short answer is that China needs a stronger military. And anyone who knows anything about Chinese history knows that in the 19th century, the wars they fought were inside China. They couldn't even keep the enemy outside of China. In the 20th century, the wars were all fought on China's borders. And most countries try to keep wars away from their borders. And so it's natural that China would want to have a military that could better deal with potential threats. But China is the central kingdom. It's surrounded by 14 countries, some of whom are big nuclear powers, and some of whom are very significant middle powers, and some of whom are much smaller. And you run into what's called the defense dilemma, which is if China is strong enough to deal with all of the potential threats to China, it becomes a threat to all of its neighbors. And that, in fact, is the central contradiction in China's foreign policy right now. When it acts in a way as President Xi is calling for, but it's becoming more active now, not passive like the past. But when China behaves like an emerging superpower, its neighbors all don't like it or feel their interests are being compromised. And so what's the pattern of behavior of a very powerful China in terms of making sure that its neighbors do not feel that they are being dominated or threatened? Now, from a Chinese standpoint, you can easily answer that, because the concept is a benevolent China, the Wang Dao. It's not the Ba Dao. The Wang Dao can be the most powerful figure, but it treats in a benign way with the countries around it. The trouble is, China's neighbors all feel from their history that that's not the way China behaves when it has the power. So this is a dilemma for China, and since China has to develop with Chinese characteristics, I don't feel qualified to give him the answer to this. But it's a problem he's going to have to wrestle with, because the more powerful China becomes, the more he has to deal with the feel of threat that his neighbors will feel.
Yes, the gentleman back by the camera on that side there.
Hi, my name is Malcolm Whitehead, and I'm actually a recent graduate of SAIS, so it's nice to be back here in Rome Auditorium. It's been too long. My question is more specific, and hopefully it's not too specific, because I'd really be curious to see what the panel thinks. But about 2 weeks ago, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about Operation Fox Hunt. And more specifically, within Operation Fox Hunt, it was Guo Wengui, or Miles Kwok, I think he's better known in the U.S., and activities that Chinese have been taking within the U.S. that are it's not like cyber attacks that happen from afar or clandestine activities that kind of happen behind closed doors. It's really law enforcement activities that seem to represent a real contempt for U.S. sovereignty. And I'm wondering if there's been cases of similar situations in the past, or if this signals something new in the way that the Chinese government views the U.S. government, or signals some change in the relationship, because it really is kind of a strong. If you read the article, I mean, it went as far as the FBI confronted these Chinese officials, and they continued to pursue Miles Kwok anyway. Just total disdain for the laws that govern this country. Is that something new? Is it
Recent.
Does it signal a change in the relationship? Because again,
well,
it's not like
they do this in various places. I mean, they do it all over the world, and so and this is the more active China that we're talking about, and so they have their sense of what's right and wrong, and they go ahead and do this sort of thing, and so it's a real problem as far as I can see. If you're interested in state sovereignty and borders, and I think and from the American political point of view, this is a very offensive thing. The FBI doesn't like this one bit, and so. But I think it's a very recent thing. It's in the last several years, but they've done this, and they've gone after Hong Kong publishers and people that are Swedish citizens, and they drag them back to China, and then they confess to their sins, and totally extra legal.
We need to differentiate, and incidentally, this is not a brand new problem. We've had this problem in spades with Taiwan in the past, where they were snatching people here illegally.
Killed them in Daly City, as I recall.
And doing things, and we've had to admonish them on that. We need to differentiate between fox hunting, which, as I understand it, fox hunting with Chinese characteristics, means going after people who have engaged in illegal activities and absconded with the wealth or whatever they have to foreign countries. And so they have a program to track down those people and to try to bring them to justice. In most cases with the United States, that's done through cooperation with the FBI, because we have no interest in harboring criminals in the United States as long as the criminality of the accusations is credible, because we also worry about so-called political problems as opposed political culprits as opposed to criminal culprits. But it's quite possible that the Chinese at times engage in the type of activities they've engaged in Hong Kong and Thailand, which is snatching people illegally and trying to spirit them out of the country. And our law enforcement people do everything they can to prevent that type of behavior. But we also have cases, we don't have an extradition treaty with China, but we have cooperated with China in sending criminals back to China. So this is, it's a question of staying within the rule of law, which we think is necessary. And by and large, the Chinese stay within it. but they don't always.
Yes, ma'am. And that'll have to be the last question, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Jane Tan with Sina News, Xinlang. Ambassador Roy, is there anything we can expect from this first trip of Trump to China? And a broader question, I know before Trump take the office, people are assuming this America First rhetoric as a lot of people interpreted it as isolation. And 10 months later, do you agree with that notion, or do you see Trump's doing the foreign policy in a different way? Thank you.
I find American First as a slogan kind of redundant, because I was 45 years in the U.S. government as a representative of the United States abroad, and we always put American interests first. I mean, and I never dealt with a foreign country that didn't put their interests first. In fact, if you read President Xi Jinping's work report to the 19th Party Congress, he makes it quite clear that China puts China's interests first. But he didn't put up a slogan of China first. He put up a slogan with Chinese characteristics, but that was applied domestically in terms of that. So what I would like to come out of this is, at Mar-a-Lago, Xi Jinping did us a favor. He educated President Trump on the complexity of the Korean problem. And at the end of the summit, the president said, gee, I didn't realize it was so complicated. Well, I would hope that that educational process would continue. And that when President Trump comes away from China, he'll say, good gosh, these are really complicated issues we have with China. We're going to have to work harder at dealing with them. That would be a very positive outcome in my judgment. Because one of the outcomes of the Mar-a-Lago summit was extraordinarily good. They set up these 4 main channels of dialogue between the two countries to deal with these complicated problems. They set up a 100-day work program to try to come to grips with the trade problems. In fact, it wasn't able to produce much. It produced something that the American business community actually liked, but it didn't solve all of the trade problems, and those have to be addressed more effectively. But I think the main problem in addressing those effectively so far has been the lack of unanimity within the Trump trade and economic team over what approach we should be taking. So I don't necessarily want dramatic outcomes from this summit visit, but I think it could be a very positive visit if the president comes away thinking, good gosh, we really got to work with China on a whole range of issues, and that's the best way to approach them.
Well, I want to thank the panelists and thank all of you for good questions and wish you all a good afternoon.
Well, do you think
It's a pleasure to be on the panel with you.